All right, let me start with a simple thought. Most cyber attacks don't begin with fireworks. They begin quietly. A login that looks normal, a message that seems routine, a process that behaves just enough like a human to slip through. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the damage is already underway. That's the problem we're talking about today, and it's why the first real AI cyberattack countermeasure matters more than most people realize. When I say first, I don't mean the first security tool ever branded with the letters A and I. We've had automated defenses for years: rules engines, signature databases, pattern matching, useful tools, but limited ones. They work best against yesterday's attacks. The moment something new shows up, especially something adaptive, they start guessing, and guessing is not what you want a security system to do at 3 in the morning. So let me ask you something. If an attacker uses AI to think, adjust, and learn while the attack is happening, does it make sense to defend against that with a fixed set of rules written months ago? That question has been sitting in the background of cybersecurity for a while now, and it's finally being answered in a serious way. To understand why this is different, we need to talk about what AI-driven attacks actually look like, not the movie version, not glowing code on a dark screen. I mean the boring, practical version, an AI system that watches how a company's network behaves over time. It learns when people log in, from where, how fast they move between systems, how they usually make mistakes. Then it slowly imitates those behaviors, not perfectly, just convincingly enough. That's where traditional defenses struggle. They're good at spotting things that are obviously wrong: a login from the wrong country, a sudden spike in traffic, a known malicious file. But an AI-powered attack doesn't rush, it blends, it waits, it experiments in tiny ways, the same way a human attacker would, except it can do it thousands of times without getting tired or distracted. I've seen this shift firsthand. Years ago, most breaches followed a predictable pattern. You could trace them backward and see the same mistakes repeated. These days, the trail looks more like noise, small anomalies scattered over weeks or months, nothing that triggers an alarm on its own, but together they tell a story. The first true AI countermeasure starts with a simple idea. Instead of asking, "Does this match a known attack?" it asks, "Does this make sense?" That might sound vague, but it's actually very precise when done correctly. Think about how you notice something's off in everyday life. If a close friend calls you and speaks slightly differently, you might not notice right away. But if the tone stays off, the timing feels strange, and the conversation doesn't quite flow, eventually your instincts kick in. You don't need a checklist. You recognize the pattern of that person, and when it drifts too far away, it stands out. That's the model here. The countermeasure builds a living understanding of how a system normally behaves, not just averages, but relationships, how one action usually leads to another, how long things typically take, what kinds of mistakes are normal and which ones aren't. Now here's the key difference. This system isn't static. It keeps learning, but it does so cautiously. It doesn't blindly accept new behavior as normal just because it happened once. It looks for consistency over time, context, and intent. That's not an easy thing to design, and it's why this didn't happen 10 years ago. Let me give you a grounded example. Imagine an employee who usually logs in from a laptop during business hours, accesses a handful of internal tools, and sends emails at a steady pace. One day, their account starts accessing files at odd intervals, not fast enough to look like a data dump, not from a new location, just different. The sequence of actions doesn't line up with how this person normally works. A rule-based system might miss that entirely. Nothing is technically wrong. But an AI countermeasure notices the subtle mismatch. It doesn't panic, it quietly raises its confidence that something is off. If the behavior continues, or starts branching into areas this user never touches, the system intervenes. Sometimes that means slowing things down. Sometimes it means requiring additional verification. Sometimes it means isolating the activity without tipping off the attacker. That last part matters more than people think. One of the biggest mistakes in early security systems was being too loud. Attackers learned to listen for alarms. If something triggered an obvious response, they knew to change tactics or back out. A smarter countermeasure stays calm. It watches longer. It gathers more certainty before acting. Now, let's talk about the word countermeasure because it's doing a lot of work here. This isn't just detection. Detection alone tells you something bad happened. A countermeasure changes the outcome while the attack is still unfolding. The first generation of these systems focuses on a response that's proportional and reversible. That's a fancy way of saying it doesn't slam the door until it's sure. It nudges, it delays, it introduces friction, and that friction is often enough to break an AI-driven attack. Why? Because these attacks depend on feedback. The attacking AI probes, observes the response, and adjusts. When the system it's attacking becomes unpredictable in a controlled way, the attacker's model starts to fail. It can't tell if it made progress or triggered a defense. Over time, its confidence drops, and its behavior becomes noisier. That's when it finally stands out clearly. This is one of those moments where experience really matters. People who've spent years in security know that certainty is rare. You're almost always working with probabilities. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to shift the odds so heavily in your favor that attacks become expensive, slow, and unreliable. There's also a misconception I want to clear up. This isn't about replacing humans. In practice, these systems work best when they support experienced analysts. They surface stories, not just alerts. Instead of saying, "event detected," they say, "here's a sequence that doesn't align with anything we've seen before, and here's why." That changes how teams work. Analysts spend less time chasing false alarms and more time thinking. They can ask better questions. Is this a compromised account, a misconfigured process, or something genuinely new? The AI doesn't decide for them, it gives them leverage. I remember a conversation with a security lead who described it perfectly. He said, "It's like having someone who never sleeps, never gets bored, and remembers everything, but still knows when to ask for a second opinion." That's not hype, that's a practical description of what this countermeasure actually does. Of course, there are limits. Any system that learns from behavior can be tricked if it's fed carefully crafted inputs over time. That's why the most effective designs include constraints. They know what they're allowed to learn and what should always raise suspicion, no matter how often it appears. Certain actions simply carry more risk, and the system treats them that way consistently. Another important piece is transparency. Early AI tools in security were black boxes. They made decisions no one could explain. That didn't fly in real organizations. This new generation makes its reasoning visible, not in mathematical detail, but in human terms. What changed, when it changed, how confident the system is, and what evidence supports that confidence. That builds trust, and trust is what determines whether these tools actually get used or quietly sidelined. Now, zoom out for a moment, because this isn't just about enterprise networks or big corporations. The same principles apply to cloud infrastructure, industrial systems, even consumer platforms. Anywhere behavior matters more than credentials, this approach has value. Think about how many systems still trust a login far too much. Once you're in, you're assumed to be legitimate until proven otherwise. That made sense when attacks were fast and obvious. It makes less sense when compromise is subtle and prolonged. Continuous evaluation of behavior closes that gap. There's a philosophical shift hiding in here too. Security used to be about walls, strong perimeters, clear boundaries. Today, it's more like immune systems, always active, always learning, rarely dramatic. You don't notice them when they're working well. The first AI cyberattack countermeasure is an early version of that immune response. It doesn't promise invulnerability, it promises adaptation, and adaptation is what matters when both sides can learn. Of course, attackers won't stand still. They'll try to poison the learning process. They'll attempt to mimic normal behavior more closely. They'll experiment with randomness to avoid forming patterns. Some of that will work for a while, but randomness has a cost. It makes attacks slower and less reliable. And again, the goal of defense isn't perfection. It's to raise the cost until most attackers move on. One thing I find reassuring is how much human judgment still matters. These systems don't replace experience, they amplify it. The best results come when teams understand what the AI is doing and why, when they treat it as a colleague, not an oracle. I've seen organizations try to deploy tools like this without changing how they think about security. They expect magic, they get disappointed. The ones that succeed are the ones that accept uncertainty as part of the job. They use the AI to narrow that uncertainty, not eliminate it. There's also a lesson here for anyone building technology, not just security systems. When you design tools that interact with humans, explain yourself, show your work, let people understand your confidence and your doubts. That transparency is what makes trust possible. As we move forward, you're going to hear a lot of noise about autonomous defense, self-healing networks, and systems that fight back. Ignore most of that. The reality is quieter and more thoughtful. It's about systems that know when to act and when not to, when to intervene and when to observe just a little longer. That restraint is a sign of maturity. So what does all this mean for you listening right now? Even if you're not running a security team, it's worth paying attention to how behavior-based systems are shaping the digital world. They influence how access is granted, how trust is earned, and how mistakes are handled. These ideas don't stay in one domain for long. We're at the beginning of a long transition. The first AI cyberattack countermeasure